Not even a television legend like Johnny Carson was immune to feeling uneasy around certain guests. Over more than 30 years hosting The Tonight Show, he welcomed over 22,000 people, from Hollywood stars and powerful politicians to extraordinary yet ordinary talents. Most interviews were delightful, but some guests demanded caution. Not because they were rude or difficult, but because of their presence and behavior, unpredictable, strange, enough to silence an entire room. Behind his charming on-camera smile, Johnny was an exceptionally sharp observer of human behavior. He could detect tiny signals, a fleeting glance, an unusual gesture, or a shift in speech rhythm. Those subtle changes often revealed that the backstage tension was far greater than anyone on the audience side could imagine. A producer who worked with him for over a decade said that Johnny occasionally admitted some guests truly unsettled him, not for being aggressive, but because their energy and actions were unpredictable. Today, we'll uncover these 9 remarkable guests. The people who made television's calmest man cautious, making him watch, think, and measure every word and gesture. From latent chaos to eerie silence, from ambiguous behavior to cold detachment, these were encounters that even Johnny Carson could never feel completely comfortable with in his own studio. Even Johnny Carson, television's calmest host, sometimes faced moments of unease. Among thousands of guests on The Tonight Show, one of the most unnerving encounters involved Truman Capote, the acclaimed author of In Cold Blood. Known for his delicate, idiosyncratic voice and unpredictable presence, Capote didn't just step onto the stage, he seemed almost otherworldly. From the moment he sat before the microphone, a strange tension filled the studio. His whispery voice often broke mid-sentence, then continued as if no time had passed. Carson, ever composed, immediately sensed this would not be a typical interview. A longtime producer observed a pattern that genuinely worried Carson. Capote's delivery, the pauses, the sharp yet quiet inflections, and the mysterious glint in his eyes created an atmosphere of subtle but intense tension. On camera, Carson maintained his charm and professionalism, but backstage, those familiar with him noticed slight signs of unease, tiny shifts in expression, barely perceptible hesitations. One particularly unsettling appearance in 1975 found Capote clearly intoxicated. He rambled about death, celebrity secrets, and supernatural experiences. Rather than a witty, engaging guest, he emanated an almost spectral presence. The audience was unsure whether to laugh or worry. A cameraman recalled that Capote's stammering voice was nearly incomprehensible, but the truly eerie aspect was his gaze, staring off into space, then smiling vaguely at Carson. Carson tried to keep the atmosphere light, attempting to guide the conversation normally, but Capote kept diverging. He whispered strange questions, referenced people who had died under mysterious circumstances, and chuckled softly. It was not mere eccentricity, it was the combination of his frail frame, whispering voice, and fragmented storytelling that left the studio silent. The interview became so disjointed that producers made the rare decision to cut it short. During a commercial break, Carson reportedly said Capote's voice sounded like a haunted house whispering its own memoir. When the show resumed, he explained that Capote was unwell and moved on to the next segment. For once, the iconic smile and effortless charm of Carson gave way to genuine concern. Carson's unease wasn't solely about Capote's intoxication. He had encountered challenging guests before. But Capote was unique, fragile in body, intense in whispered delivery, and weaving stories of death and the supernatural. A writer present recalled Capote telling fragmented tales of people he believed had died mysteriously, then laughing quietly. Carson continually tried to normalize the mood, but Capote stared and whispered, "You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?" Those who knew Carson recognized the true level of his discomfort. A longtime associate said, afterward, Johnny said, "I don't fear difficult guests, but this felt like interviewing a ghost halfway to the other world." He was genuinely scared, something that almost never happens. This encounter led Carson to temporarily remove Capote from the guest list, not as punishment, but to avoid repeating the unsettling experience. When Capote returned years later, strict precautions ensured he was in better health and mindset. Yet Carson remained cautious throughout the interview. These moments reveal a rarely seen side of Johnny Carson, not only a master of television, but a keen observer, ready to confront the unpredictable, and at times, facing real fear, before a person. Or the ghost of one. From the very moment Klaus Kinski stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere in the studio shifted completely. There was a presence in the air that made everyone fall silent, as if an invisible storm was quietly approaching. Johnny Carson, usually confident and composed, couldn't help but notice it. Kinski's eyes blazed with intensity, seemingly never blinking. An unsettling tension spread throughout the room, making the crew fidget nervously. Johnny smiled out of habit, but his body instinctively leaned slightly away, creating a subtle distance. This wasn't the first time he had faced an unpredictable guest, but Kinski's intensity far surpassed anything he had encountered before. A stage manager who witnessed the actor's arrival later recalled feeling his heart race, worried that a single wrong move might trigger an explosive reaction. When Carson asked about Kinski's new film project, the actor's responses followed no predictable pattern. He leapt from discussions of art to religion, then suddenly spoke of the impending apocalypse. No one could guess what he would say next. Johnny tried to interject with light-hearted remarks, but Kinski's hostile stare seemed to warn, "Don't interfere if you know what's good for you." The audience fell silent, and the tension in the studio became almost tangible. During the commercial break, the producers huddled together, debating whether to cut the interview short. Ed McMahon later recalled that Johnny was so tense, yet calculating each step of Kinski's reactions without provoking him. Everyone realized this was far from a normal conversation. It felt like trying to contain a live bomb before it could unleash its energy. Small details made the interview even more unnerving. Kinski's eyes never blinked, his focus was so intense it was almost frightening. At times he stared past Carson, at other moments into the void, and his eerie smile created a ghostly impression. Every hand movement, every shift in posture seemed to weigh heavily on the room. Johnny maintained his calm demeanor, telling witty stories and attempting to lighten the mood. But those with sharp eyes could see the tension in his shoulders, in the way his smiles were slightly forced. Carson later admitted this was the only time he genuinely worried a guest might become violent on live television. Ed McMahon described Johnny feeling like he was sitting next to a bomb that could go off at any second, and his job at that moment was simply to prevent a public crisis. Cameramen recalled that every shot became more difficult than usual. One wrong gesture from Kinski could have thrown everything into chaos. Every light, microphone, and camera had to be considered carefully. The tension spread to the audience as well, who sensed something unusual and held their breath, unsure whether to laugh or cheer. A producer later said that Kinski's appearance became the gold standard for intensity and unpredictability among guests. Years afterward, whenever a particularly difficult guest arrived, the production team would reassure Carson, "At least they're not worse than Kinski." That phrase became a backstage legend, a way to remind Johnny that no matter how challenging a guest seemed, someone had already been worse. The interview continued, but the uncertainty never eased. Carson tried to guide the conversation with smart questions and humorous comments, but Kinski leapt from topic to topic. His body language seemed to defy any attempt at control. Johnny maintained his smile and calm tone, yet every crew member in the room felt the immense pressure. After the broadcast, Carson admitted that relief only came once the show ended and Kinski left the stage. This was one of the rare experiences that genuinely unsettled the television legend. Not because Kinski was malicious or aggressive, but because the combination of energy, unpredictability, and sheer presence posed a real challenge. Years later, when recalling Klaus Kinski, Carson remembered every tiny detail: the unblinking eyes, the ghostly smile, the constant volatility, and the feeling of standing next to a storm ready to explode. It remains one of the most famous interviews, not for humor or cinematic impact, but for the almost physical tension that filled the studio space. The tension in the Tonight Show studio that evening did not come from laughter or music, but from the presence of Robert Blake. The atmosphere turned immediately tense the moment he took his seat, his cold eyes fixed on Johnny Carson as if challenging everything around him. Even the usually confident and friendly host had to be cautious in the face of such unpredictable energy. As Blake settled into the guest chair, the studio atmosphere shifted. There was no laughter, no light melodies from the band, only a heavy silence. Every question Carson asked was met with a challenging, sarcastic response, sometimes just a cold glance or a curt remark. A seemingly ordinary question now felt like a test. "Why are you asking me that?" Carson tried to ease the tension with smiles and light jokes, but Blake remained unresponsive. He simply stared, seemingly evaluating every gesture, every word. The feeling, as Carson later described, was like being observed as a specimen, a prey under close scrutiny. The crew and producers recognized it immediately. No one wanted to make sudden movements, no one dared break the silence, for anything could provoke Blake at any moment. Even small details heightened the discomfort. Blake spoke in a calm, smooth voice, almost devoid of emotion, yet his words were imbued with underlying hostility and defiance. The contrast, his outward composure versus the explosive inner energy, made the dangerous tension in the room palpable. Carson, with over 3 decades of experience, maintained his smile and calm demeanor, but those paying close attention could notice signs of strain, forced smiles, slightly hunched shoulders, quick glances at his notes, and the maximum distance he kept from Blake. Throughout the interview, Carson continually adjusted his questions, trying different approaches from serious and polite to humorous. Yet Blake remained cold and detached, occasionally offering a mocking laugh or an overwhelming silence. The audience sensed the tension, remaining quiet, with no usual bursts of laughter. Every small movement from Blake, raising a hand, a subtle gesture, a glance toward Carson, became a focal point of attention. A producer recalled that Carson only felt relief once Blake left the guest chair. He admitted that this was one of the rare times he genuinely worried about his safety in the studio, not because Blake was overtly hostile, but because of the combination of his gaze, demeanor, and unpredictable energy. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't attacking either. "I just felt assessed, scrutinized like prey," Carson later told a longtime colleague. Robert Blake never appeared on the show again. Not because Carson disliked him, but because the experience was too tense, leaving the host unwilling to repeat that sense of potential danger. Years later, when Blake faced legal troubles, Carson told a friend, "I'm not surprised. There was something genuinely unsettling in that man's energy. I rarely felt such relief at the end of an interview." Blake's appearance became an unforgettable memory behind the scenes of The Tonight Show. Not for humor or showmanship, but for the pressure he brought, the silent hostility, the cold stare, and the feeling that any action could trigger disaster. It stands as proof that even ordinary guests on television could make a legend like Johnny Carson remain vigilant, fully focused, and use every skill to prevent an interview from turning into a public nightmare. The atmosphere in the Tonight Show studio that evening changed immediately when Tony Clifton appeared. It wasn't a subtle shift, it was the kind of presence that made everyone hold their breath. Andy Kaufman, transformed into Clifton, brought a chaotic energy that no one present could predict. Johnny Carson, who had faced all kinds of difficult guests before, appeared unusually unsettled this time. Clifton entered wearing an oversized tuxedo, a messy wig, oversized sunglasses, and a heavy layer of cologne. Each step he took seemed to challenge every unspoken rule of the show. As soon as he sat down, he disrupted the familiar rhythm, constantly interrupting Carson, making rude remarks about Ed McMahon, and openly mocking the female staff. No one knew what he would do next, and that uncertainty made the room tense as a drawn string. Viewers, camera operators, and producers all felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Unlike drunk or arrogant guests Carson had encountered before, Clifton was a different case. Every action was deliberate, from the defiant shrug to the slow, weighted voice. This was no longer a joke, it was an experience that left the room paralyzed with unease. Carson, trying to maintain composure, asked normal questions to steer Clifton into a standard conversation. But Clifton responded with off-topic comments, provocations, or unusually long silences. At moments, the entire studio fell silent, unsure whether to laugh or remain quiet. The chaos escalated as Clifton appeared dissatisfied with the band's accompaniment and even threw a glass of water toward musical director Doc Severson. The situation peaked when Johnny took an unprecedented step, leaving his host's seat to let Ed McMahon temporarily manage the chaos. Normally, Johnny never left his position, but this was the moment he had to yield partial control. Clifton still refused to leave the stage when it was time for a commercial break, requiring security to intervene. The atmosphere in the studio was heavy, tense, and the sense of chaos seemed almost physical, radiating to everyone present. After the break, when Carson returned, his expression showed fatigue and tension. Producers recalled that what bothered Johnny the most wasn't Clifton's disruptive behavior but his absolute commitment to the character. This wasn't a spontaneous or careless act, it was a complete dedication to chaos. Johnny had faced many difficult situations, but Clifton's devotion went beyond anything he had encountered, creating an indistinct fear, a feeling of confronting an unpredictable force. Staff later recounted that when the show ended, Carson decided never to allow Tony Clifton to appear again. Andy Kaufman was still welcomed as himself, but the Clifton character was permanently banned. This unprecedented decision in the show's history reflected the level of unease the character produced. Everyone understood that not all guests could be as intimidating as Clifton, but that night, the line between humor and chaos had become extremely fragile. What happened that evening continued to be recalled for years. Producers, staff, and audience members alike were impressed by Kaufman's commitment to the character, his deliberate chaos, and his ability to instill unease. This was not merely a television appearance, it was a testament to the power of performance that transcended normal boundaries, an experience both frightening and mesmerizing, unforgettable for all who witnessed it. When George Jessel entered the studio, it was as if the air itself shifted, heavy with echoes of a bygone era. He represented a world where jokes about race and ethnicity were once considered normal, a world far removed from the sensibilities of the 1970s audience. Johnny Carson, always proud of keeping his show relevant and respectful, immediately sensed an unprecedented challenge. When Carson invited Jessel to talk about his long entertainment career, the veteran did not reminisce lightly. Instead, he launched into performances described by crew members as songs and monologues with shockingly outdated content, peppered with racial terms and stereotypes. The audience fell silent. Not the quiet of confusion, but the kind that makes everyone think, did he just really say that? Carson's face froze in a forced smile, clearly racing to prevent disaster without creating a scene. Behind the cameras, producers and staff exchanged tense glances, ready to step in if needed. This was a moment unlike any other in the show's history. The frightening part was not just the offensive content, but Jessel's complete obliviousness to how it was received. He continued as if expecting raucous laughter, occasionally shrugging at the silence. Carson found himself in an impossible predicament. Confronting Jessel directly would lead to a public clash with an elder on live television, laughing it off would seem like endorsement, and cutting to a commercial abruptly was obvious but unavoidable. He chose the fastest path, cutting to an early commercial. When the show returned, Jessel had been replaced by the next guest. But the after effects lingered. Backstage, Carson showed unusual frustration, telling producers, "This is not how the show operates. It will never happen again under my watch." While difficult guests could sometimes return after reconsideration, Jessel was permanently removed from the guest list. The incident became a cautionary tale for the production team. Whenever older entertainers appeared, careful preparation was essential. Just mentioning George Jessel's name made bookers think twice. What unsettled Johnny most was not just the offensive content, but the gap between Jessel and contemporary reality. Here was a guest from another world, seemingly unaware that social norms had changed. The clash between Jessel's perception and reality radiated discomfort throughout the studio, a stark lesson in how historical attitudes could disrupt a live performance. Crew members recall every gesture of Jessel's exuding a sense of not belonging, from his piercing gaze and forced smiles to his commitment to old-fashioned ways. The tension felt almost physical, palpable to anyone present. Carson handled it with skill, yet the event left a lasting impression, becoming a benchmark for managing guests from past eras. Jessel's appearance remains a classic example of the clash between entertainment eras. It tested Carson's adaptability and highlighted that, no matter how experienced, facing someone utterly detached from contemporary reality could create an unforgettable moment. It stands as a lesson in sensitivity, preparation, and understanding guests, an unforgettable memory for all involved in The Tonight Show. In a mid-1970s evening, Divine's appearance on The Tonight Show left the audience and production team stunned. Not due to laughter or excitement, but because of the striking image and deliberately provocative energy Divine brought to the stage. The elaborate beehive wig, dramatic makeup, and defiant style embodied everything mainstream America at the time found challenging. Even Johnny Carson, usually calm and in complete control, showed signs of discomfort as Divine stepped onto the stage. The studio atmosphere shifted immediately. The band fell silent, the audience held its breath, and all eyes focused on Divine. Every step, every gesture radiated confidence and challenge, forcing Johnny to carefully consider each question, each smile. Used to traditional guests and predictable conversations, Carson now had to navigate an entirely different energy. Divine was neither aggressive nor rude, but simply presented themselves in a way that broke every gender norm and social expectation. Their presence created a tension that stretched across the room, compelling Johnny to remain polite while trying to maintain authority. Carson's smiles, though familiar, appeared strained, and he moved slightly farther from Divine than usual, glancing repeatedly at Ed McMahon as if seeking silent assistance. As the conversation unfolded, Divine referenced John Waters' films, Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, infamous for breaking rules and sparking controversy. Carson, experienced in guiding calm television scenarios, now faced situations he had never encountered before. The audience's reactions were mixed, some forced laughter, some silent confusion, adding to the pressure on the host. Divine appeared fully prepared and professional. Yet, it was the deliberate challenge to norms, the way they disrupted expectations, provoked viewers, and ignored traditional rules, that created an experience both uncomfortable and captivating. Johnny had to constantly adjust his approach, balancing respect for the guest with keeping the show's rhythm intact. The entire interview became a subtle test of improvisation. Johnny tried to convey friendliness, while Divine continuously tested the limits. Physical distance, strained smiles, and meaningful glances created a two-layered performance. One layer was the televised show, the other a cerebral contest between host and guest. When the interview concluded, the producers recalled Johnny's look as the cameras stopped. He breathed a sigh of relief but admitted it was one of the most unusual experiences on stage. Divine had transformed The Tonight Show into a cultural challenge, forcing the program to adapt to rapidly changing artistic and social contexts. Divine's appearance marked a turning point. It demonstrated Carson's willingness to welcome guests who challenged traditional boundaries, even when he personally felt uneasy. A colleague later remarked, "Johnny may have been slightly intimidated, but he never let personal feelings prevent him from giving the audience something truly new and thought-provoking." Divine left an unforgettable mark, not only on the stage but in Tonight Show history, proving how art can challenge society, create unease, and spark imagination simultaneously. Vincent Price stepped onto The Tonight Show stage like a gust of dramatic, unsettling energy. Unlike most guests, he brought a rare combination of subtle charm and the dark intensity of the horror films he was famous for. Every time he sat down, he radiated a presence that was both mesmerizing and slightly terrifying, forcing even Johnny Carson, accustomed to famous guests, to pay careful attention. From the moment Price appeared, the studio atmosphere shifted. Soft lighting, slowly moving cameras, and a sense of tension that was delicate yet electric filled the room. Carson smiled and reassured the audience, but anyone watching closely could detect the occasional flicker of unease behind his practiced grin. Price was neither aggressive nor rude. With his words, gestures, and eyes alone, he commanded attention, a magnetic mix of allure and subtle threat. At times, Price would speak of ordinary things, like cooking or art collecting, only to slip into a sinister tone, reminiscent of his horror roles. Johnny would laugh, yet the slight widening of his eyes or the subtle furrow of his brow revealed the challenge of maintaining composure. Admiration and enjoyment mingled with an underlying tension, a delicate balance between respect and unease. A particularly memorable moment involved Price reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven under dim lights, surrounded by flickering candles. His voice, growing intense and haunting, seemed to change the room's atmosphere, making it colder, deeper, more ominous. Carson, experienced and composed, sometimes forgot they were live on air, drawn entirely into the mesmerizing rhythm. Cameras captured his subtle reactions, a slight recoil, attentive eyes, a mix of surprise and delight. Price tested not only the audience but Carson himself. He would lower his voice dramatically, delivering lines with an eerie flair, sometimes producing unexpected props, a fake spider, a rubber bat, making Johnny startle. Each move, each glance, each smile was carefully calculated to maximize effect while remaining safe. Viewers saw Carson's mild discomfort, yet his laughter and clever responses made the performance thrilling and enjoyable. On another occasion, Price gifted Carson a small stuffed bat in a display case. Johnny's reaction was complex, polite, amused, yet visibly tense as he touched the little creature. He smiled, but in his eyes, a hint of nervous excitement appeared. These interactions revealed their unique dynamic. Carson admired Price's skill and presence but remained aware of the subtle power he wielded on stage. Vincent Price was perhaps the only guest who could simultaneously frighten and delight Carson. His surprises never irritated Johnny negatively, instead, they made each interview dynamic and unforgettable. Price understood the influence he held and used it to create moments that were thrilling yet enjoyable, forcing Carson to adapt, balancing professionalism with genuine reaction. Through his appearances, Price demonstrated that horror art was more than film, it was experience, sensation, a clever challenge to both host and audience. Despite occasional unease, Carson maintained respect and admiration, showcasing his professionalism. Price's moments on The Tonight Show engaged every sense, leaving the audience laughing, startled, and eagerly anticipating what would happen next. The blend of charm and menace, subtlety and theatricality, made Vincent Price one of the most fascinating guest-host relationships in Tonight Show history. It proved that even when someone makes you uneasy or slightly afraid, professionalism, intelligence, and mutual respect can turn the experience into true artistry. Price left a legacy not only in horror cinema but also in shaping how audiences and hosts perceive drama and allure on live television. Margot Hemingway walked onto The Tonight Show stage in the early 1980s, still radiating the elegance and allure she had as a top model. But almost immediately, something was off. Gone was the confident, radiant energy the audience knew. Instead, there was a subtle tremor, an underlying tension in her eyes and voice. The crew quickly sensed that this would not be a typical interview. When Johnny Carson asked questions, Margot seemed to hear them, but also appeared elsewhere. Her responses were fragmented, her voice inconsistent, and at times she fell silent for long stretches, staring into empty space as if time had stopped. Carson, always sensitive to his guests, looked genuinely concerned. He maintained his smile and led the conversation, but every gesture, every glance, conveyed a deep human concern, a desire to shield her from the pain she carried. A producer recalled that Margot often answered questions Carson hadn't asked, drifting into an entirely different conversation. Her tangents were disconnected, creating an uneasy tension. The audience sat in awkward silence, punctuated only by occasional coughs. Carson, normally masterful at guiding audience energy, seemed unable to lift the mood. His short, careful responses were not signs of impatience, but attempts to stabilize the moment. His unease was rooted in concern, not frustration. Whenever Margot faltered or seemed lost, Johnny tried to anchor her with simple, straightforward questions. Yet her answers often remained rambling and incoherent. The studio seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on her, sensing that this was no performance, it was a glimpse into a woman struggling with herself. Tonight Show became a mirror for her inner turmoil, and Carson's empathy was palpable, offering a safe space without adding pressure. This appearance underscored that Tonight Show was more than entertainment. It was a place where human vulnerability could be revealed. Carson, experienced and composed, was profoundly affected by her energy. His patient, gentle handling of Margot showed a humanity that went beyond professional skill. A director present that night recalled Carson's unusual silence afterward, not due to work, but in response to what he had witnessed. Crew members later remembered that the signs Margot displayed on national television, uneven voice, vacant stare, drifting between answers, were early indicators of the struggles she would face: addiction, bipolar disorder, and the pressure of living up to the Hemingway legacy. Carson instinctively recognized these signals, and his responses, patient, kind, non-judgmental, revealed a deep empathy. When someone jokingly suggested Margot had lost it, Carson immediately dismissed the comment, saying, "She's not difficult. She's in trouble." His words reflected an awareness of the profound suffering beneath her behavior. Years later, after Margot Hemingway's tragic death, crew members remembered that interview as a clear, though initially unrecognized, warning sign. That segment remains one of the most haunting in Tonight Show history. Not for humor or drama, but for the raw fragility it revealed. Margot Hemingway appeared with all her beauty and pain, while Johnny Carson faced the moment with sensitivity, respect, and humanity. Attentive viewers could sense the tension, but also Carson's compassion and professionalism. The moment demonstrated that television is not just entertainment. It exposes humanity, allows moments of vulnerability to touch hearts, and shows that empathy can ease the suffering of others. Margot Hemingway, with her beauty and fragility, left a lasting impression on Tonight Show, a moment that no one who witnessed could forget. When Andy Warhol entered the Tonight Show studio in the early 1980s, no one could predict what would happen. Unlike familiar guests or celebrities with distinct personalities, Warhol brought a completely different energy, a profound silence and a passive demeanor that unsettled everyone subtly. No one on the crew had ever seen anything like it, and even Johnny Carson, who had faced countless unexpected situations, appeared genuinely baffled. From the moment Warhol sat in the guest chair, the familiar rhythm of the show was broken. Carson asked natural, witty, sometimes thoughtful questions, but Warhol replied with a single word, a nod, or simply stared without speaking. His eyes, indifferent and distant, created a strange void in the studio, making the atmosphere tense and unpredictable. Everyone on set felt the oddness immediately. A cameraman recalled, the audience didn't know how to react. Some laughed lightly, others stayed silent. People kept glancing around, seeking confirmation that the strangeness they felt was real. Rarely did a television audience feel so uncertain, unable to laugh or clap because they couldn't decipher what was happening. Warhol seemed fully aware of the effect, turning his passivity into a performance art more than an interview. Carson tried everything to break the tension. He told humorous stories, made witty remarks, even highlighted the unusual nature of the conversation, hoping to draw Warhol into dialogue. Nothing worked. Warhol maintained his calm, with a fleeting smile acknowledging the joke without engaging in the normal flow of conversation. Open-ended questions about art, personal projects, or anecdotes that Carson attempted to elicit, Warhol met with curt responses or silent nods. The void forced Johnny to rely on every skill and ounce of experience to maintain a semblance of rhythm. A backstage writer recalled Johnny seemed like he was speaking to a living statue, a silent being that made the heart race. At one point, Johnny bluntly asked, "Do you want to be here?" Warhol simply shrugged, neither confirming nor denying. Johnny joked afterward, that man could be made of wax. Behind the laughter was clear bewilderment, a sense of being unable to control the situation. Unlike difficult guests in the past, Warhol showed no aggression, drunkenness, or erratic behavior. Instead, there was coldness, detachment, and an existential void that everyone felt. A director that night described it: "It felt like time itself was distorted, everything moving differently. Not hostility, just a subtle, palpable fear in the space." Carson, whose career was built on human connection through conversation, faced a guest who rejected all basic norms. The experience was both frustrating and fascinating, challenging his interviewing skills while opening a new dimension for the show. Crew members remembered that afterward, Carson was both irritated and intrigued, unable to stop thinking about what had transpired. "It was either the worst interview I've ever done or a brilliant art performance, and I couldn't tell which troubled me more," he joked, revealing the depth of his genuine disorientation. This became an internal legend, the gold standard for uncomfortable silence on The Tonight Show. The audience could only watch, unable to interact normally. The detachment and strangeness drew viewers into a unique experience, where a guest could disregard all rules and still make the show unforgettable. Warhol's appearance demonstrated that The Tonight Show was not just entertainment. Sometimes, it was a stage for artistic experimentation, where human interaction was tested to its limits. Over time, Carson rarely mentioned the Warhol interview. Perhaps the discomfort was too profound to revisit, even as it was remembered as a classic. That moment lives on in the memories of those present as proof that art and television sometimes collide in unexpected ways, leaving even masters of the craft bewildered. Looking back on the unforgettable moments on The Tonight Show stage, Johnny Carson admitted that fame and talent didn't always make him comfortable. From Divine, who challenged every norm, to Vincent Price, whose charisma mixed with chilling drama, Margot Hemingway, fragile yet burdened with deep pain, and Andy Warhol, whose haunting silence unsettled everyone, each guest left a unique mark, leaving Johnny both perplexed and fascinated. These experiences created not just memorable interviews but also highlighted Carson's adaptability and deep respect for each individual. Perhaps it was these moments that made The Tonight Show legendary, a place where entertainment, surprise, and emotion converged perfectly.